Joining us now, Jon Shelton, professor at the University of Wisconsin at Green Bay, author of The Education Myth, How Human Capital Trumped Social Democracy. Jon, welcome to the program.
Sam and Emma, thanks so much for having me. And I want to say at the outset, if Fox News is looking for a leftist perspective to replace Tucker, I'm willing to do it. Okay, and I'll even take about half the money that he's been getting to do it. So
that is very generous. Because I think they're probably looking to cut costs. But that would, of course, I'm not implying that would be the reason why they would choose you. You're worth every penny of that to them, I'm sure.
And I'm sure Fox News really cares a lot about ideological diversity. So it could be a good move for them.
Well, you could report, and then I guess they would decide. Or you offer, and then they decide. Apparently, Don Lemon is also out. So if you want to make a pitch to CNN, that also is an opportunity.
You know, that's true. Opportunities abound today. That's great. That's great.
Well, I'm glad we got you before you moved on. But all right, let's start from the beginning in terms of like the development of public education in this country, which was also sort of a departure for you as an academic in terms of like this era. First, tell us about the beginnings of public education and how unique it was, and really what the impetus was for public education. And it had different phases, I guess, where it would expand. What drove those, and then ultimately why you had to start there?
Yeah, that's such a great question to start with. So, you know, I'm a historian who does primarily late 20th century. And when I undertook this book, I was trying to understand how it was that Americans think about education over time, because I think there's something really important how Americans think about it recently and what we expect it to do, and how that's led to some disastrous political consequences. And I'm sure we'll get into that. But to answer that question, I had to go all the way back to the nation's founding and think about what it was that Americans at the nation's founding expected the education system to do. And, you know, it's not that I was surprised, but when I studied this systematically, it was pretty clear to me that for the vast majority of American history, Americans didn't see education in terms of, helping people get jobs. It was about everything but that. So you go back to Thomas Jefferson in the 1770s, and let's not romanticize Jefferson, right? He only saw white people as being capable of, being citizens in a democracy. But he argued for a public education system in Virginia because he said Americans needed to, be able to understand power and be able to, in a new democracy, understand corruption in its many forms in order to ensure democracy continued. Going to the 19th century, you've got education reformers like Horace Mann pushing for education in order to, kind of help Americans be citizens in a democracy. Mann was really thinking a little bit more about kind of reining in some of the impulses of democracy. But the point was he wasn't pushing for education and job training. And then, you can take this into, after the Civil War, when freedmen and freedwomen during the Reconstruction era in the South were pushing for public education, but again, not because of its connection to job skills, but because they wanted to see, they understood full equality of citizenship as connected to education and being good citizens. And you can go into the 20th century, right? I mean, some of your listeners might be familiar with this presidential commission in the 1940s called the Truman Commission, which was obviously convened by President Truman. The Truman Commission is a fascinating thing to read because this commission essentially argued for 2 years of tuition-free higher education, but not because Americans needed job skills, because in the context of an increasingly complex world, Americans needed to be trained as citizens. They needed to be able to think broadly and understand that context. So it's only very recently, comparatively speaking, relatively speaking, that Americans have, seen education primarily in terms of job training.
And what I find fascinating about that sort of, brief history of the promotion of education as a tied to the sort of civic knowledge and the, as people as citizens within, is that it crosses over different sort of periods in terms of technology and industry. I mean, look, to become educated, in Jefferson's time, the idea of it being a vocational investment would be absurd, right? I mean, you go and you an apprentice. There's not, and I think that's arguable, well into the late 19th century. And then to see Truman, when we're certainly well past the, deep into the Industrial Revolution and past essentially, the idea that still you don't go to school to increase your earning potential. You go because there's an inherent value to society to have educated citizens. That's what I think is really fascinating about that sort of like broad stroke of history.
Yeah, Sam, and that's such an important point, because if you kind of take the flip side to that, which is how is it that Americans thought about economic opportunity and economic security? And the way they thought about it, especially in the context of the Industrial Revolution and more working people effectively losing their economic independence, right? Having to work for wages in the marketplace and really having their economic fortunes dictated by increasingly wealthy employers, is the primary means that working people used to fight for a better future. It wasn't to argue to their kids to go out and get a good education. It was, let's organize unions. It's, let's push for minimum wage laws and maximum hour laws and child labor protections, which, up until very recently, I thought was kind of a settled question in this country, but apparently it's not. But, and then that all culminates in the 1930s with the New Deal, where you have the institutionalization of many of these calls from working people, things like the Wagner Act, which, enshrined workers' rights to organize and collectively bargain and go on strike, which people at the time called labor's Magna Carta, Social Security. And then, in the 1940s, in the context of World War II, FDR even calls for an economic Bill of Rights, a second Bill of Rights, kind of crystallizing a lot of these things that working people had been pushing for. It was deeply popular. And that really framed the conversation in American politics for the next, after World War II, for the next 30 or 40 years. And I think to a large extent, Americans have forgotten that. I don't want to romanticize that era by any means. I mean, we know that, there's a lot of racial inequality that continues to exist, which is why the civil rights movement is there. It's a kind of breadwinner model that disadvantages women in the labor markets. But at the end of the day, the premise of American politics during those years was to try and secure and expand as many economic and social rights for Americans as possible. And that's really what we've lost in the past few decades.
Well, that's what I think is also important to understand, that, because as we get into the part of your narrative where education takes on a different role, it's important to understand what was filling that role prior to education being tried to be shoehorned into it. And in other words, if you want to make more money at your job, the primary mechanism was unions, essentially, and organizing. And that was where, broad based. I mean, it's amazing in many respects how the union density and the education density, if you want to say in terms of higher education in LA, sort of has flipped from where it was 100 years ago, 90 years ago. As we get to that part of the narrative, I guess there's a question as to whether that was how on purpose that was. But let's move up through that. I mean, talk a little bit more about the Truman Commission, because I was not terribly aware of that history. So only somewhat, let's put it that way. And it really is fascinating. Truman, we really missed the boat with Truman. There was a couple of things that he floated during that was floated during that era, where things could have gone in a very different direction in this country, it seems like.
Yeah, the Truman administration really was, in many ways, we don't give him enough credit. In many ways, it was kind of the logical extension of the things that FDR was trying for. So one of the things I talk about in the book is that just a year after FDR, comes out with this Economic Bill of Rights speech, there's a major effort called the Full Employment Act that would essentially guarantee all Americans jobs. And this was deeply popular. It was polling at probably 75%, something like that. And this bill, which Robert Wagner, this really important senator who authored the National Labor Relations Act, right, which established workers' rights to organize, Wagner said this bill is FDR's legacy. And it sailed through the Senate, and then forces of reaction, Southern Democrats who didn't want to see workers have more power because of its connection to racial equality, but also, Republicans in the North who were growing reticent of the power of workers. They kind of organized, and business opposition organized against it and kind of watered it down in the House. But Truman really went to bat to try and get that law passed. And then again, to the point about higher ed, Truman also supported health, universal health care, major healthcare reform. And then with higher education, with these presidential commissions, you have to think about the people that, that are appointed to these commissions, right? Because obviously they're doing the actual work. But Truman basically, when he charged this commission, he said, I want you to go out and essentially determine what higher education should do, particularly in this more complicated world, and a viable path forward to provide it to as many people as possible. And, the commission included people like Horace Cowan, this intellectual from the New School, who had kind of pioneered this idea of cultural pluralism, that, the way American society should exist is that the Americans and all their sort of diversity, should sort of work together to develop a common path forward. And so that's why a big part of the Truman Commission was about advocating for higher education, because that was really the place that was seen as, this is where you go to really learn everything that's going on, to think critically. They actually the commission talked about higher education as being kind of a school of democracy. I mean, it's fascinating to think about, something with the imprimatur of the president making that argument now, when, what we've gotten from politicians in the past, 30 or 40 years, especially from Democrats, is, education is the great equalizer. The path to a good job is through college. The commission wasn't talking about that at all. In fact, the final commission report actually kind of criticized some young Americans for thinking too much about the connection between economic opportunity and a college degree.
So, okay. And as we get closer to where things turned, right? What was leading up to that? Because there is this sort of radical turn away from that, it feels like. And some of the worst things that we have in this country all seem to have happened at a very similar time basically in the early 70s, if you will. And, or at least that's where they start to begin. What was it like? What were the forces going into it? Because we had a lot of pushing for national jobs guarantee. It was a vision of MLK's at that time. You write about the Randolph and the Rustin freedom budget. Yeah, tell us about that, because this is all sort of culminating where there really does feel like we need to short circuit this stuff. And how do we? What do we do to short circuit it? That sort of feels like that moment that we're building to.
Yeah, absolutely. So what happens is, a school of economists really, but it's led by these economists at the University of Chicago named Theodore Schultz and Gary Becker, come up with this concept of human capital in the 1950s. And
of all places too, we should say. I mean, of course, it's coming from the University of Chicago.
Exactly. And, they even sort of admit, Becker writes about this, that, we have to be careful about using the word human capital, because the main way it had been referred to before in the United States was to refer literally to enslaved people, right? That they were the sort of human capital that you could use as collateral for loans and things like that in the antebellum US. So, but this term human capital are, kind of their own entrepreneurs. That the capital is what they have, and they can add to it, which will then get them higher wages, which will, effectively allow them to profit the same way that a capitalist company profits. And if you think about what it's doing, it's a sleight of hand, right? It covers up what's actually going on under capitalism. Anybody who works for a boss, and my students intuitively get this when I tell them this, their boss is taking a cut of what they produce. Otherwise, there's no reason to employ them, right? I mean, you don't have to be like a hardcore Marxist to understand that. Even LeBron James, he's only making the contract that he's making because the owner is turning a profit, right, from his labor. So that idea kind of works its way into the economics profession, and it's a very seductive.
And just to be clear on that, so the human capital is really just hiding the fact that really I'm selling my labor.
Exactly.
And unlike capital, my labor is finite. I mean, I can work, 24 hours a day theoretically. I'm not going to last very long, but it's a finite amount of labor I can expend. Whereas theoretically, capital is not necessarily finite, right? I mean, it could grow exponentially. It does for some people
over time, as opposed to someone's labor power.
Yeah.
Even with the LeBron James example, his skills are going to depreciate. So sorry, Sam, to cut you off.
Well, yeah, but that's the point. And so that's the other reason why that sort of like, it's a misnomer, and it's done to hide. It's done to pretend like labor and capital are really more or less the same thing. It's just that we have different, this guy's got a machine and cash, and you've got, your arms.
Exactly. And if you think about what it does, it provides this it's a fairy tale that workers have more control over the labor market than they have, right? That if you just go out and get the right education, and add and augment your human capital, you'll be able to do better for yourself. You'll be able to turn a greater profit. But if you think about the number of things that workers can't control in the labor market, right? Whether they live in a state where it's easy or hard to organize, whether, racism or sexism discriminates against them. These are things that Gary Becker, when he wrote about human capital, called the tastes of employers. Whether the economy is doing well or not, whether the Federal Reserve is purposely trying to induce a recession because workers have too much power. All these things are outside of workers' control. But the idea of human capital and individual investment in human capital provides this kind of, fantasy, if you will, that workers have this much more power. And thus, think about the flip side to that. If they're not doing well, if they're not able to get economic security, for whatever reason, they deserve it because they didn't have the presence to get the right human capital.
And so this starts to develop in the ideology, I guess, starts to develop in the 50s and 60s out of the University of Chicago, like most horrible economic ideologies. And how does it start to go into practice? I mean, and we should say the thing I found fascinating about your book here too is that education is also used. Education is being used in lieu of like directly dealing with the question of labor. But we see this like every day in elementary schools, and like, how are we going to deal with kids not getting fed? How are we going to deal with poverty? How are we going to deal with, all the social ills that come from that? We just leave it on the schools now. It was sort of a genius move. Did you come across any indication that this was how self-conscious or how conscious this shift was?
Yeah. So here's what's happened. So first of all, Schultz, this economist from Chicago, he's not really like a libertarian economist in the way that like Milton Friedman or these other, folks from the Chicago school are. He's actually more of a neo-Keynesian. So there were a lot of folks in the Johnson administration who, kind of bought into the argument, right? And I don't think anybody in the Johnson administration, in the 60s was like twisting a mustache saying like, let's do this instead of other social reforms. Obviously, the Johnson administration was committed to a number of really important reforms. That's how we get Medicare and Medicaid. But what I argue is that this growing kind of human capital myth idea, competes with this social, what I call the social democratic idea, the idea of social investing in social and economic rights that runs through things like the freedom budget and the 70s, which really would have guaranteed people jobs and done something about the poverty that existed in so many inner cities and actually rural parts of the United States. But that, for partially because of political expediency, right? The Vietnam War is going on, and that's becoming a point of conflict, but also because, you know, people who become elite political figures often believe in the idea of meritocracy. They believe in the power of education because it did actually open doors for them, even if it is impossible to, you know, actually rectify all of the injustices that exist in our world. And so kind of between those two things, you know, they vie with each other. But then when you get to the 70s, there is conscious class warfare from above by corporations, right, to make it harder for workers to organize. This is actually when the union avoidance industry is pioneered, efforts to outsource blue collar jobs. And so in that context, when workers without college degrees are not doing all that well, and you've got this enormous pressure on their livelihoods, suddenly this becomes something that's, you know, more palatable for neoliberal politicians, especially Democrats, to say we've got to kind of lower the expectations of government and focus on education, because that's the one thing that few people are going to say, no, we shouldn't invest more in education. We're kind of getting to that point now with, you know, Republicans and sort of where their party has gone. But for a very long time, from about the 70s, you know, through honestly, you know, the election of Trump in 2016, the biggest sort of bipartisan consensus you can find in this country is the idea that investing in education was important, and important because it connects to labor needs. Because again, it's a very, very seductive idea, because if you can just invest in education, you don't have to change any of the other power dynamics in society, right? And it gives people something that they can, politicians in particular, something they can grasp onto to make an argument, you know, what they see as a winning political argument.
Yeah, you mentioned the Vietnam War. I didn't want to pass through that before asking you about this. How conscious was the threat of kind of like an educated citizenry that was standing up to, especially young people, powerful actors in government? Because it seems to me that, yes, obviously the shift of education being to make citizenry versus to make workers you lay that out so well. But the conjoining political factors too of consciousness and social movements also, I feel like, it has a story here.
Yeah, so that's such a great question, and I don't write extensively about this in the book, but there's a moment in the 1970s. It sounds like tinfoil hat stuff, like political conspiracy, but all you have to do is kind of just go and read it. There's literally a report by the Trilateral Commission in the 1970s, which is this commission that's put together by all these political elites. David Rockefeller, you know, from the Rockefeller family, connected to, you know, banking interests. And this is 1974, 75. Carter's Zbigniew Brzezinski was a member of the Trilateral Commission and became a big part of the Carter administration. And again, it sounds tinfoil hat. I hesitate to almost to bring it up. But effectively, what the Trilateral Commission argues is that for the stability of the West, the Western, you know, democracies, basically they had to tamp down the democratic aspirations that young people were pushing for. And it's not an accident that you see the party, the Democratic Party in particular, move in that direction. So in 1976, Humphrey Hawkins, which was a bill that was, you know, co-sponsored by Hubert Humphrey, this liberal Midwesterner, and Augustus Hawkins, founder of the Congressional Black Caucus, who represented Watts. They were basically saying, we need a jobs guarantee. There's high unemployment. We've got to do something for working people. Coretta Scott King actually organized to sort of led the effort to mobilize grassroots support. She called it Martin's Legacy. There were hundreds of demonstrations across the United States. And Carter, you know, who was, again, you know, kind of, I think, influenced by this line of thinking and just, you know, sort of looking at the direction the Democratic Party was going, literally says in 1978 in the State of the Union address, we need to accept that government can't do everything. It can't give people a job. People need to lower their expectations. And, you know, so there is a direct moment in the 1970s when the Democratic Party kind of moves pretty, you know, explicitly in that direction.
Well, like, you know, that period of time, and we've, you know, over the years interviewed so many people, from, you know, Lily Geismer, who really is focused on this era quite a bit.
Incredible, by the way.
and both of them actually. I mean, and having grown up in Massachusetts around that time, had seen some of this, but this is such a big jump in the course of like 6 years, right? I mean, 6 to 8 years, and the education thing fits in with the sort of this push for neoliberalism, which had been growing since Mont Pelerin and in the late 40s, and we see Milton Friedman gets sent out down to Chile and gets a chance to do a dry run here of this, and this push for education, so that people understand how it fits into the neoliberal sort of like framework. It is just providing juice for someone to enter the marketplace, essentially, energy within the marketplace. It's like the marketplace is going to settle it out. We're going to do, the input is not going to be structurally touching the marketplace at all. It's just that we're going to train people for the marketplace better. And that's where this twist on education comes. And we get a guy like Carter, who had some positive aspects, but also very anti-union, coming from the South, and the education, just almost like on a dime, starts to become a commodity that it has like a dollar value that you can place upon it in the marketplace, as opposed to an important thing for society to maintain for the stability of the society, just broadly speaking.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And one of the ironies of American politics in the 70s and 80s is this. I looked at for this book, I looked at a lot of the records of the Democratic Leadership Council, right, which is this organization that Clinton comes from, and changes the trajectory of the Democratic Party dramatically.
And he was the first president, I think, of the DLC, wasn't he?
He wasn't the first president, but he
was president when he declared.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but what's really important about that is that the DLC, when they were kind of making their arguments, especially in the mid 80s, right? And the DLC is an organization of elites, right? I mean, it was called Democrats for the Leisure Class by Jesse Jackson, right? Their argument was that the party needed to move away from special interests. That labor and civil rights activists had been pushing the party in a direction that was unsustainable. But the irony is that they kind of used that idea at a time when actually those folks were already losing influence in the party, and these sort of professional class neoliberals were gaining influence. And education is really a central linchpin. And what I say in the book is that this sort of version of education, right, this human capital version of education, it does work, because what it allows Democrats, either whether Carter, who elevates the Department of Education during his term, or Clinton, who starts pushing for as president of the DLC, and then and also as governor of Arkansas, and then of course as president, to push education reform as the answer to all of these other inequalities that exist. And so the work that it does is it says it's okay if we're negotiating free trade deals that hurt the livelihoods of blue collar workers. It's okay if we have to go after the social welfare state by drastically changing the welfare system, because what we're going to do is invest in education. And if anybody wants that education, they can go and get it and be more responsible for themselves. And this is how we're going to change things. It does the work of letting these folks off the hook for the fact that they weren't actually responsive to the needs of working people.
Yeah, it shifts the argument from one of power and structure into a sort of like a technocratic. I mean, this is like, I'm a little bit like, I am probably more sympathetic to technocratic answers, but than many, but it shifts it becomes a category error where what is a question of power and power dynamics gets shifted into a technocratic solution that does not really address the power dynamics there. It just basically makes it about like, well, we'll see who rises to the top, and talk about the meritocracy issue, because I mean, this is I mean, again, though, just to go back on this one more second, the DLC came out of like the drubbing that Democrats got from Reagan, and the Reagan victory created, I think, a certain amount of panic. We had already headed down the road, and it was almost like at that point, almost there's a slippery slope there once you start to head there, and you get with Reagan. Because when I went to college and after Reagan's first election, everybody was saying realignment, or maybe it was the second one. Realignment has happened. And so there's this full-on panic. But what I'm fascinated by is that first, half of the decade in the 70s, McGovern was a little bit hostile to unions. There was an attempt to disempower unions. In fact, our democratic small d primary system that we have in the Democratic Party was in response to an attempt to disempower unions who were picking the candidates essentially behind closed doors. One could argue that, we should have a little more democracy in this way, but it came at the expense of unions, and that just kept going. Like there was another solution. Like, how are you going to do it? If you're not going to empower workers, if you're not going to give workers the ability to collectively empower themselves, how do you give them the ability to like individually empower themselves? But once you move from collective to individual, it becomes a very different sort of like you're addressing a very different thing.
Yeah, and think about the work that does to collectively disempower people. So if you look at how Americans in the past 10, 20, 30 years have thought about the political system, there's infinitely less faith that government can do things to improve their lives. There's infinitely less faith in institutions like Congress. Now there's other reasons beyond just the education myth for that, of course. But what you see is just a complete generation of folks who are disaffected by politics, and that's one reason. Honestly, go back to Tucker Carlson for a minute, that he's been able to make this sort of connection as this Fox News analyst with this sort of false version of populism, because he trades in that kind of stuff, And I think one of the things that frustrates me about this kind of argument about Reagan is, there were idiosyncratic reasons that Reagan got elected. I mean, in 1980, it was a referendum on Carter as much as it was anything else. And then you've got an incumbent president who runs for re-election after, the recession that he induced ends, right? And so he's able to kind of take credit for that. But look at what's happening in Congress. Democrats, for the most part, maintained control of Congress during those years. Think about when was it that Democrats, our Congress really became up for play in the way that it has been in our
Clinton.
memory. 1994,
right?
It's 1994, and you think about what's so important about that. It's NAFTA. I mean, you had millions of workers who worked their butts off to get Clinton elected in 1992. Organized labor was firmly behind him, looking for labor reform. Instead, he comes in and negotiates NAFTA over the objections of labor. Has cost blue collar workers, manufacturing workers, hundreds of thousands of jobs, including many in my state of Wisconsin, which has, moved in this direction of it's a complete purple state, and has given space to reactionary Republicans over this kind of thing. And, all those workers who lined up to support Reagan in 92, I'm not saying this is the only reason that Republicans won in 94, but it wasn't because Contract for America was this deeply popular thing.
Well, that was released like 2 weeks before they got elected. I mean,
Exactly.
Nobody knew what that was.
Exactly.
I mean, and we should say that in that 92 election, Clinton only wins with 45% of the vote.
That's right.
People, Ross Perot was there basically saying, you're going to hear this giant sucking sound, and that giant sucking sound is all the jobs are going to go down to Mexico. And then you did, and Clinton has like we're also going to pass, labor standards and environmental standards. We're not going to pass them. We're going to make a side agreement with Mexico to do that. Yep. They never do it. And so that sucking sound actually does happen. And then we move into sort of like the learned code world, essentially. And like the internet bubble of the late 90s, I think hides what has happened to a large extent. And it starts to come out. Just talk about the concept of meritocracy, because I find this fascinating. because this also Clinton, Obama, these are guys who were, born into, like, they were not born into elite families in any way. They had every reason to believe the meritocracy functioned because they were one of the people, it's just like, how do you, you'd have to be an odd type of person to think like, I'm president of the United States. I got here because I'm totally lucky, as opposed to like, I'm really good at this.
Right.
But you can be really good at it and also be totally lucky because there's 1,000 other people who could be sitting there. They just, luck went a different way. Well, just talk about that concept of meritocracy, because I actually have a funny story about with Obama.
Yeah, for sure. And first of all, like Thomas Frank has written beautifully about this in Listen Liberal, how the Obama administration in particular kind of bought into that, and how all these other folks in their administration were all essentially elites, right? After you have this huge popular push for Obama, right? People were voting for change, and then it's like business as usual with the Ivy League elites running the economy. But the very idea of meritocracy, it's not sustainable. It's not an idea that can really be the core of a democracy. And Michael Sandel, this philosopher who wrote a book called The Tyranny of Merit. This is a book I highly encourage people.
I think we did an interview with him on this, actually. I think sometime back.
because what he kind of says there is, all right, like too many times we push on, especially on the left, for an economy or even a country that's going to perfect the idea of merit, that you get what you deserve, and let's figure out a way to like make that happen. What he says, and I agree with him, is that the very concept of merit is problematic, because how can you have a democracy when you basically say, for whatever reason, people who don't do as well as others are not essentially going to be full citizens. They're not going to have economic security. They're not going to have what he calls social esteem. And that has done untold damage. I'm a university professor. I think anybody who wants to go to college should be able to do it. And I think it's a incredible thing for people to do. It opens their eyes. It teaches them how to think. But that doesn't mean that I think that anybody who doesn't go to college doesn't deserve to have a good job and social respect. And that's one of the things that's really lost with the concept of meritocracy, where you're basically saying some of our fellow citizens deserve to be losers. And I refuse to accept that.
I feel like I can tell the story now. He seems to be totally out of politics. But at one point, when Eliot Spitzer was out of politics and was at CNN, I was working with him or going to be on that show, and we were at a Christmas party, and this was around the time that Obama was listening to all of those Citigroup people, and I was asking him, like, do you think he actually believes this? And he said, Obama grew up in, had very humble beginnings, and he said, and he really believes these guys deserve to be where they are. And he says, I went to Princeton with all of them. I know they're all C students and cheat at tennis, is what he had said to me. And I think on some level that was like, that is, part of the problem is that the meritocracy was sold so hard, and the people who rise to the top assume that it works, because otherwise they have to say, like, they have to attribute, the just complete luck to the fact that they're there. And so they presume that everyone else who is at the top, who are there because their parents were legacies at Princeton or they were wealthy, they just assume they belong here too. And then that's how all of our policy gets formed.
Yeah. Now, can I tell a story about Obama real quick?
Please.
So 2008 was the first year I ever voted in a presidential election. And it's not because I'm super young. I was, I think, 30 years old that year. It would be 30. And the reason for that is because I didn't believe that presidential elections really mattered for a lot of, especially young people. But I can remember where I was when I decided not just to vote for Obama, but to support him in the primary. And I can remember this very clearly because this was February 13th, 2008. I was in the hospital. My daughter had just been born. So it's like she was born the day before. She shares a birthday with Abraham Lincoln, which she hates when I point out. But February 13th, 2008, I can remember watching this speech. It was in Janesville, Wisconsin. I write about it in the book. And Obama gave a speech where he was clearly trying to separate himself from Hillary Clinton, who I was unenthused with at the time. And in the speech, he basically, this was right when the GM plant, which eventually would go under in Janesville, remember that was a big part of that campaign that year. And Obama basically said, I'm going to be different than other politicians. We've had a Washington in place that privileged trade. And he even said something like,
I'm sorry, we lost you for a second. That privileges trade. Go ahead.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Am I good? Yeah. Okay. And so he said that privileges, trade deals and economic elites at the expense of working people. And he even said something like, and I'm going to do things differently because I know politicians come here and promise you things and then they never deliver on them. But you can count on me because I come out of community organizing. I'm an activist. And I said right there, this is the person who I want. And I think millions of other people thought the same thing, that this is a chance to move the Washington, D.C. in a very different direction that actually, puts the interests of all working people front and center. And then, the second that he comes into office, and look, he did some good things, right? I mean, like the healthcare bill, I would have preferred, universal healthcare, of course, but it did expand coverage to a lot of people, right? It did some good things. He did some good things, but then to essentially just bring in, Ivy League elites into his administration and bow down to the pressure of finance interests after the economic recession, when ordinary people were losing their homes, to me that turned people off. And you can document this. There were something like 5 to 7 million voters, who voted for Obama and then voted for Trump in 2016.
Right. And it's amazing from February. I think we've seen now documents maybe in late summer. Froman, I think his name was John Froman, who was a Citigroup official, basically handed him a list of people who'd have in his cabinet. Froman also, just coincidentally with that speech that Obama gave, became his the top trade negotiator and negotiated the TPP, which would have been essentially NAFTA, but much, much larger.
NAFTA on steroids, as I believe.
Yes, exactly. Jon Shelton, really important piece of history for us. Really appreciate you coming on talking about it. The book is The Education Myth, How Human Capital Trumped Social Democracy. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm. Thanks so much for talking to us today.
Thanks so much, Sam and Emma. This has been a blast.
Thank you.